computer. Okay, so I always I began a man I began to be a mannerist. I noticed I always start with okay, you know. I mean, I should change the introduction. So Ricardo Porro, born in 1925, died in 2014, and he was born today. It was a little bit difficult to find his date of birth because on the British, English and British Wikipedia, it just says November 1925. But on the French Wikipedia, it says the 3rd of December 1925. And the site where I take my dates of celebration or paying homages also has the same date, December 3rd, 1925. So Ricardo Porro Hidalgo was a Cuban born, you see even here, I mean, this was from the American Wikipedia, was a Cuban born architect. He graduated in architecture from the Universidad de la Habana, University of Havana in 1949, and built this year his first project, Villa Armenteros in Havana, following which he spent 2 years in postgraduate studies at the Institute of Urbanism at the Sorbonne in Paris. Well, that's not a little thing. I mean, yes, it was immediately after the war, but it shows that, he was already on his way to, some professional accomplishment. This was the man, and I like the way he looks. He seems to be intense and sensitive, and he seems to have known something about suffering, or I idealize my through my perception. I don't know, but I like what I see, and I like what he might have represented then, and even the surroundings of his picture, with that lamp, and if it is indeed a lamp, and whatever is on the right, it's a nice picture, I think. And here he is in his older age. He doesn't look really like a man who doesn't have enough verticality. I think he does. And but here he is at the age when he already accomplished many buildings, and not buildings without architectural interest at all. Although, again, you will be surprised because he was indeed unique, especially for that time. Now, the sites where I took my informations from sometimes, and I had no time to correct, the phrasing would start with a small, like here, small v. But please forgive these, details if you can, and we move forward. Unfortunately, I couldn't find pictures for his domestic works within Cuba. At that time, I guess in the 50s in Cuba, it was complicated. He might have been considered just like Konstantin Melnikov in Moscow as a bourgeois architect. It's possible. After all, it was a communist country, and to build villas, it sounds a little bit incongruous. But the same happened with the next one, another villa, San Miguel a la Havan. This also I couldn't find pictures of. Then the third one is different. This is a major work by him, the Cuban National Art School. And it makes me envious of the level of sophistication, of togetherness, of democratic spirit, of experimental atmosphere that this school was encouraged to promote and express architecturally. It is a major work of architecture, and no wonder I have many pictures. I found many pictures on Arch Daily, and it is one of his most important buildings. It's also called in English the National Art Schools of Cuba, Ricardo Porro, Vittorio Garatti, Roberto Gottardi. So 3 architects, but he was the main one. This is a view from the top, from the air, à vol d'oiseau. And, Is this communist? Is this capitalist? Is it what? It's architecture. It's an architecture that transcends political ideologies, and it was built. It was built in a country which the West and especially the United States considered as being, repressive and irrelevant to culture, or culture being irrelevant to it. But I don't know how many Western countries built such a large campus for the arts as Cuba did at that time. And he was young, rather young, and I read about this building that, well, some parts had been neglected, but all in all, it's also some pictures that I have belong to different times. They were taken at different times. So, it's very possible now it is very well taken care of and refurbished and so on. Model, it was a work in progress. It kept growing and developing, and maybe it continues to do so. It's an architecture maybe here not as surprising as some buildings he built in France, but we'll arrive at those buildings built in France as well. And he built a lot. But in France, he worked with a partner. Here, he worked both alone and with those two gentlemen with whom he built this campus. There is a certain exoticism in his architecture, but it is not, alarmingly, different or, other. There is an otherness in his architecture. And again, please consider the time. We are talking about the 50s, mid-century architecture, mid-20th century architecture. If you look at similar works, architectural works around that time all over the world, you won't see too much, exoticism, really. It was more like some kind of international style, a certain belief in, not so much fluidity, but rigor and rectangularity, Miss van der Rohe. But here you will see at times he was very exotic. I would say he was, and probably is, the architect who understood butterflies the best. And you will see some buildings where the butterfly motif is very explicitly present. Here, on the other hand, we have an architecture of structural rigor, clarity, but also not a dry clarity, I would say. And I think it's a good building and a complex of buildings. If the spirit of architecture is genuine and is alive, then I think any so-called style is acceptable, except perhaps the very worst style itself, because I think great architecture is somehow beyond style or styles, especially in contemporary times or modern times, because I don't think, I know the word is sometimes still used, even in relation with the moderns, but I think, for example, Le Corbusier would have protested. I don't think he would have liked to have his work labeled with the word style. So, these buildings seem almost, they make me think a little bit of Arcosanti, of Paolo Soleri. So they have this almost extraterrestrial quality. And look at the pavement, it's not flat. It has its undulations and its, more or less discrete, curves, which makes it interesting, I think. And this is often not done even in very fluid architectures of today. This is a problem even with Zaha Hadid or Med architects. They make very interesting and flamboyant even buildings, but often the slabs are horizontal slabs, which is a problem because if the slab doesn't have itself some kind of accidents and fluidity, then there seems to be some artificiality here there. But it seems that Ricardo Porro handled it when it was the place to have a horizontal circulation like here. He did it quite well. So there is, structural integrity, but there is more to it. And maybe this fact that he organized the whole scheme as a conglomerate of pavilions. And you see, even when the building is, kept in a questionable way, if the architectural conception is genuine, the spirit of its creator comes through, I think. And so a certain level of nobility is not affected by the poor care of the building, I would say. Now, of course, we saw many excesses in architecture. We saw many forms. We saw many experiments. Maybe we are not very, very excited about what we see now here. But we have to understand this was built in Cuba in 1950s. And, Cuba was not the richest place on earth. And I don't know if it had an interest in innovative architecture. But here, not just the architecture was to an extent innovative, but also the social program. I understood this was a building meant to encourage creativity in a very exuberant way. Castro seemed to be at that time favoring developing cultural programs at a national level. Again, this is something perhaps to be envied. I mean, there was demagogy in communism as well, that, culture first, art first, but there were restrictions. But in Cuba at that time, at least at the beginning, it seems it wasn't so restrictive, the intellectual or the cultural climate. So there are also elements, kind of traditional. Here, he's not as wild as he will be in some of his later works. You'll see that. I still like this complex of buildings. And yes, there are leakings probably. Well, there are leakings everywhere in the world, in Vienna, in New York. It doesn't matter, I lived in various places, in various apartments at the top floor, and I have to say, the leakings are almost unavoidable. Now, he's more domestic than Louis Kahn. I mean, you could be tempted a little bit to think of Kahn a little bit in connection with this building. Kahn seemed to be more radical, but Ricardo Porro was more radical himself in some other buildings, and we'll arrive at them. Now, the tree, of course, such a glorious tree is in itself a wonder. So, almost it doesn't matter how the building is, but look at it, the magnificent tree. So, 1950s, Havana, Cuba. I don't know exactly, probably because of political reasons, he left Cuba and settled in France. And we'll see some works he did soon after he arrived in France. Now, with I don't know if he had a PhD in architecture or urbanism from Sorbonne. I guess he was already on his way to accommodate himself to the French culture. he is not, although I think he is relevant for us today, with other architects like Bart Prince in the United States. I mentioned Paolo Soleri. There are certain architects who didn't follow the modern paradigm explicitly or predictably, like so many other architects. So they are a little bit off. Why? Because they promoted an organic architecture. And organic architecture, strangely, even in the United States, didn't have too many followers. I was very surprised when I attended lectures at Columbia University in New York to see that and hear that actually New Yorkers never mentioned the name of Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, they were seduced by Europe, by the European architects, starting with Le Corbusier, but they didn't mention, you know, the most important architects, local architects, if we can call them so, you know, Sullivan, Richardson, Wright. So I was very surprised. Of course, in the Midwest, things are different, but on the East Coast, strangely, they were much more interested in European architecture than in their own culture, their own architecture. That one that actually gave character to the North American architecture. Look at the plan. I think it's beautiful. You know, probably, you know, this, you know, he proposed various developments truly, like truly to be a world in itself, the world of art. But I love the site plan. You know, it's organic, it's mysterious, it's intricate. It's very, very nice. It makes me think a little bit, but it's much more fluid and organic than some exercises by John Haydock. They are very, very different architects. But I think Ricardo Porro, if these buildings would have been built just as he insinuated them on this site plan, would have been great. Anyway, he built something and he couldn't build other things. Now we go to Liechtenstein in 1975. So he left. I don't know, it's possible because of political reasons. He left Cuba, he settled in France. And now we'll see the Centre d'Art, the art center, Lord Durand, the gold of Rhine in Liechtenstein. It's an European building, but look at this. With the exception of this part of the building, which is more pedestrian and you know, predictable, but what is here, I think, is very interesting. And he never, well, not truly never, and not truly totally, but he, I think, avoided the trappings of postmodernism for a good part of his work, which was not easy at all. With Renaud Delanoux, this was his partner, so they created together their office, Porro and Delanoux, and I think they did a few remarkable buildings, and we'll see all of them. Yes, it is an European culture. Yes, it is a culture which has a certain level of predictability, but it also has things that were very unusual at that time. I don't know if this artwork belongs to them or to an artist commissioned by them, but there seems to be kind of the same spirit also in the building. Some kind of an exotic Gothicism, or in other words, there is a Baroque sensibility. There is also this fortress-like aesthetics, but it is sweetened by, you know, look how the glass is done. You know, it's the glass part of the building is also a creation. It's not just, it doesn't just, you know, put some glass here. It's a creation. You can tell it has a certain complexity. So on the other hand, as a whole, the building expresses unity and integrity, and to an extent force. But he also has, or they have, these kind of things. This is what differentiates their architecture from other people's architecture. Of course, there are other French architects who, I mean, even if you didn't know that this was done by an architect who lived then in France, you would see something of the aesthetics of modern architecture in France after the war and after the death of, or about the, Le Corbusier died in 1965. Well, this one was built in 1970 something. I find his architecture interesting because he's able to create unexpected parts of the building there where it matters, and that is in the public parts of the building. He built several schools. They built several schools, and you are going to see them, both colleges and high schools, and some of them quite interesting. Look at the interior. It has character. It has a certain level of complexity. It has a certain level of exaltation. It is not Antoni Gaudi, yes, but it was built in the second half of the 20th century. And again, the type of sensibility that we see here at work is rather unique, as far as I know, in modern architecture. On the other hand, he can be reticent. Yes, there is spectacle, there is play with volumes and a certain drama, but in good measure, his architect could also be reticent with some accents, like here, which intrigue, which invite you. It's this corner, this part of the building is where the entrance into the building takes place. So it's a special place. It's the place of encounters. It's the place of the ritual of transition. You step over the threshold there. So it has to be different. And it is different. And look at the plan. This is Ricardo Porro. It might have certain similarities to an extent with Hans Scharoun, maybe. Then there was another couple in the 80s, a little later, German architects, I forgot their names. But, European organicism is different from the North American one. Here we have a French expressionism, but with some rooting in Cuba. So, there is an inevitable, probably, exoticism, being generated from this fact alone. Immeuble de logement, Astens, so this is from 1990. Again, how many architects use the ellipse? It's just a courtyard, but still the composition is, the spiral is present. The spiral in itself is a scandal for intelligence, just like the labyrinth. We saw these kind of stairs leading into the buildings by Aravena, but because here we have the courtyard that is elliptic or ellipse in shape, things are a little bit advocating a certain irrationality, if I can say so, and a certain kind of moving against, the certitudes of the circle. Paolo Portoghesi maybe also could come to mind, a certain architecture by Imre Makovic, perhaps, but still, Porro, Ricardo Porro is different. So, Collège Colonel Fabien à Montreuil, this one I have in two versions in the presentation. One is just the Fabien's École. The other one, this one maybe is more, the wording is more correct. Collège Colonel Fabien. Sounds a little bit strange not to have a, military figure give the name to the college. But again, the building has a certain level of fluidity, which at the time when it was built wasn't so very common. They were still working manually, hand drawing, and I had a hand drawing, a handmade drawing in the presentation, but it was so ugly, in my opinion, that I had to eliminate it. A kind of a rendering,
Dan,
yes.
yeah, if you do this kind of a column and this kind of an element, the roof in a, I think, design school, I mean architecture school, it'll be very difficult to justify it.
To
uh,
what?
Sorry,
It would be difficult to what?
difficult to justify it in a jury. I mean, in your exam jury, uh, if you do this kind of an element, the column
Well, of course,
column.
and also look here, look at this cornice. I mean, but the
They'll
problem with most schools of architecture is that they are stuck. They are actually not looking through the window. They don't look at nature, at trees, at bushes, at birds, and they don't look in their own soul. And that's why we have so much dogma in Ahmedabad and in Bucharest and in other parts of the world, because people think that certain things cannot be done. But why not? I actually think this is a very valid architecture. It might not be in accordance with our own beliefs, but no, it is valid. In my opinion, it is valid. This one is valid too. It has a certain expression, is, but why not? This is the edge, is the corner of the building. So, as I said, he was a unique architect, especially for his time, but even for our time, perhaps. Um, Look, you know, this is Europe, the second half of the 20th century. Yes, most schools of architecture would accept something like this and not something like this. But why not? Just because they look unusual, they seem to have rigor. Look at everything, the way it was built, the roofing, and yes, I think he was genuine as an architect. And if I'm to compare this building to this building, I'm sorry, I like this one more than this one. I mean, this one is blunt, is brutal, is simplistic. This one you could criticize if you want to criticize a certain mellowness or mellow line of it, but all in all, it's an attempt to create something else, something different, something maybe a little bit medieval, but also a little bit futuristic. I find it interesting, and he also worked. He didn't work with that overused, curtain wall. No, he has windows, windows. But there is a large repertoire of windows here. I think is interesting. And look at this. These are houses. This is an apartment building. Can you believe it? But why not? Why shouldn't an apartment building look like this? I don't think it's more to be blamed here than in a regular, so-called regular, apartment building that we have so many of. Now, this is an interesting work finalized in 2003. I don't know very well. I mean, I know how to translate in Romanian, but in English, concernment is something, I don't know. But look at this. Obviously, there was some influence from deconstructivism, but you cannot say that this, what we see here, doesn't have a certain appeal, certainly for those with a disposition towards deconstruction. He was already, 75 years old, 78 years old when he built this, when they built this, but it's interesting. And it's not just that. It's look at these interstitial spaces. We'll see pictures with the building finalized as well. These are just some pictures during construction. Like here, you can tell that this is an adventure for the builder, for the architects. It's a quest, it's an adventure, it's experimentation. I think that's how architecture should be, like, yeah, like an event, like bringing something new into the world. And yes, there might be difficulties and pain even, and expenditures. But if we go through the effort of building, why not try our best to bring something to the world that would add a little bit of wonder to the world? We need that. I think we need things to take us out of our inertia and complacency. And that's what I think usually great artists and architects and musicians and writers and so on did and do. We need a poet, and he was to an extent a poet. You might not like his poetry or like just part of it, but he was a poet. Look here, just at these elements. You say they are gratuitous. They are, why are they there? Well, not everything that we do is to be explained or made legitimate by reason alone or functionalism. I don't think so. I think that's him here, yeah, because he has a cane. I like his, coat, and this is probably his partner, younger. And I look at the building, how it is being built. We saw this one, and there are all kinds of things happening here. You could say, well, this is very close to Eric Owen Moss. Yeah, to an extent, it is. But there is something else. And here I know they drew mostly manually. I don't know if specifically for this building. But they were not, they didn't have, a factory like Frank Gehry, with NASA-like. No. These are analog architects, so to speak. And maybe, yes, later they also began to use computers. But he used to be like this even before the arrival of the computer. Now we see the Lycée High School Julie Victoire Daubier is from 2010. And well, this one looks a little bit like a stadium. It's probably a large building. It is a large building. And I don't know, this is not one of my preferred ones, although there are parts of it which are interesting. And I mentioned the butterfly. You see even these columns. It's an interesting idea, to create a column which doesn't reach, doesn't go all the way to the ceiling, but then you have the intermediate part, these two wings, so-called butterfly wings, that support actually, that have the structural role. So it's an interesting idea. The column doesn't reach actually what is supposed to support. And then you have a third element, in this case, these wings that do that job. Interesting, I think. And I don't know of another architect who did something similar.
Dan, isn't this influence of Venturi Scott Brown a little bit?
I don't really.
This element above the column.
No, I wouldn't think that Venturi Scott Brown influenced him, because Venturi Scott Brown were immersed, or they emerged themselves from a different kind of culture. I think he is mostly who knows, some atavistic part of his upbringing, of his childhood, in Cuba, maybe his love of nature. You will see in other parts of in other buildings by him an explicit reference to butterflies, but he's also an abstract artist, and so yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't no, because there is also an expressionism here, like in this part of the building that but it's a curved expression, so to speak. It's not an aggressive really. Yes, it could have been, but it is not, because this curvature, turns around, and it becomes, if not graceful, but it becomes accommodating. So this is not German expressionism, and the butterfly wings create this literal reference to something that, in its essence, is about the beautiful ephemerality of nature. The butterflies. I suggest to you, if you want, there is a little poem by Joseph Brodsky called "The Butterfly." And even Emile Cioran talked about the butterfly. The butterfly is fascinating. It's so beautiful, and at the same time, it vanishes. It's almost a beautiful non-existence. And so, to bring the butterfly into architecture, or the metaphor of the butterfly, is rather unique. I don't know of any other architect who does it. This is the plan. And this kind of Baroque aesthetics, at least in part Baroque. In some parts of his buildings, he is reticent, but in others, there is clearly a Baroque sensibility. Now, if he was from Brazil, which has a great tradition of Baroque art and Baroque architecture, if I am to think just of Aleijadinho, the little cripple, but not only that, there is a very important Baroque art and architecture in Brazil, but he is from Cuba. So also at that time, who had the courage to bring in decorative elements? Because these wings, or whatever they are, we could call them with different names, do have I think a decorative function, even if in some cases would also, even here, look, is this column supports two beams, interestingly, through these intermediate, I call them butterfly wings, but could be called in any other way. It's an interesting idea, because it is an interesting idea which also connects with the tradition of architecture. The classical columns had a capital, which was also had volutes, and had a certain formal complexity. Here, he replaced that with these abstracted large-scale elements. So it is as if, let's say, this is a structural element. This is a structural element, but in between them, he introduces something which, in its essence, evokes vulnerability. So he brings in a level of instability, at least mental instability, and because of it, the structure that could have been heavy is not heavy any longer. It's almost as if you would say, well, these I keep calling them, maybe they could receive other words, other names. These butterfly wings support the heaviness of the building, and I like the sensibility behind it, because it's very much Lao Tzu or Lao Tse, who advocated, who saw that the weak, the so-called weak, can be stronger than the strong. And he gave as an example, the blade of grass, which lowers its head when the thunderbolt strikes, and the oak, if the oak, the proud, solid, rigid oak, is hit by the thunderbolt, it dies, but not the blade of grass. He also mentioned water, which seems to be vulnerable and weak in its conflict with stone, with a rock. It actually erodes the rock. The weakest water erodes the strongest stone or rock. Here, I'm just improvising, but it's something that I like about this idea Also, you know, I mean, in conventional architecture, you just had here straight column, you know, you had a vertical column and then the horizontal curved or not beams. But here, it brings the column outside of the structure, and from its top and on its side spring two other elements that support the horizontal structural elements. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting idea, and I never saw it done before, uh, except in classical architecture, where you had the intermediate element between the column and the beams, which is the capital, which could be done in a Doric way or the others, Corinthian, composite, and Ionic. This is also an interesting building. Uh, Here also he's thinking of a discrete joining of the column, in this case not vertical, and this roofing. So there is a certain legerity, there is a certain it is not heavy, something which could have been heavy. On the other hand, maybe there is a little bit of I don't know, I mean, there is a little bit of there is a ludic element in his architecture, but the telluric is a little bit different, is different from Gaudi, Antoni Gaudi's. His architecture is organic, but I don't know if I can explain now well what I feel, particularly looking at this building. The butterfly still insinuates itself in the windows, done in a certain way, which brings some question marks in relation with the clarity of the structure. And these question marks, I believe, are again valid. So this heavy thing is actually not as heavy thanks to the way he supports it, I think. And you see, he's not afraid to take risks. Here, he could have placed a vertical column. No, it's not vertical. Neither this one, and neither this one, I think. This one might be, I don't know, but these two are not, obviously. Now, this is a psychiatric hospital from 2007. The problem with his architecture is, if I am to think of Alvar Aalto also had spaces that were not dramatic in terms of the handling of the volumes of the masses, but in the more public parts of the building, they became more lyrical or more expressionistic. Ricardo Porro does the same thing, but there is, I think Alvar Aalto was a little bit more convincing than Ricardo Porro. But on the other hand, Ricardo Porro is very different from I mean, this is a Latin sensibility here and a certain exuberance that the Nordic, the Scandinavian Alvar Aalto would not have had easily. Although there was expressionism in Germany, in the north as well, very much so, in Hamburg, Fritz Höger. But that expressionism was rather anxious. This is not anxious. It's not an anxious, he doesn't seem to be an anxious architect. But there are these erosions. You see, something is eating up the building. The building seems to be rather serene and predictable and regular. And then something happens, an event, like here, and this is, I think, interesting. It's important to have surprises in a building, I think. And he creates surprises in some select places, not everywhere. A police station. This one also has, yes, there was an influence of deconstruction. You see the first Ricardo Porro and I forgot his first name, Lanu. Um, Here you see almost something of Daniel Lipskind, but at the interior, this is something that Lipskind would not have done, because here there seems to be some kind of a longing for a certain kind of centrality. It's almost like these are almost like sun rays emanating from a sun-like figure. And I don't know, I find it interesting, although it is a deconstructionist building, at least here, but there is also something else. I wonder what the policemen felt there, but the work of the police is a work which inevitably has at least sometimes conflict, even war. I mean, war on drugs, war on criminals, war on who knows what. So violence and deconstruction is part of the job in a way. So I would say it's appropriate. This is another building which is a little bit conventional here, but also has some interesting parts, relating to the to the public spaces within the building. Then this is an typical Ricardo Porro architecture, and is in this very coherent, and he does it often. And it's really about destabilizing the classical, or the predictable, the stable, the rigid, through various techniques or strategies. Um, Also interesting what is happening here, because as Vatsal said in a previous meeting, that you don't need really for a column a lot. Maybe the sufficient vertical structural element is just this one, the metallic one on the left. But what is near it is rather decorative. So I think this is also interesting. Now the famous Fabian School, and you have more pictures of it here. Again, the trademark butterfly wings. The plan. Look at the plan. Who was working like this? At the time when he was doing. Yes, this was early 80s, but I think the planning began earlier. No, it says November 1990. So he was some kind of a pioneer, I think, in the field of European, not expressionism, but organic architecture. And look at the plan. This kind of plan wasn't very common, really, because it is based on the vortex, on the spiral, and as such is essentially dynamic. Not everywhere, but in some parts. And it is Baroque, but a modern Baroque. We saw this one. Now here, with the exception of the vertical columns, but when we look at those spiral like stairs, we are not really too far away from even Frank Gehry, or but the columns have a certain connection with different kind of aesthetics and different kind of static, structural work. And I think he's not that he struggled, but he tried to negotiate between more traditional way of doing the structure and something newer. He also worked with domes, and this is not at all a typical deconstructivist strategy or technique. This is also an interesting school complex. We saw already a few pictures. We see the plans. Maybe Vatsal was right to an extent, maybe one could interpret some of these things somehow connected to complexity and contradiction in architecture, maybe. But these are not really elite buildings. So I mean, these are buildings built for maybe even underprivileged communities. But look what is happening here. Again, the same strategy. This third element, which is important, and I think inspired by this strategy, you could arrive at some interesting proposals. Look even here. All in all, I would prefer, all in all, I would prefer this than to this. I'm not saying you could have very noble and interesting prisms, but that one doesn't really qualify or seem to be very noble. Sorry, an extension, another lycée, another, kind of a high school. Again, the butterfly, and I think we'll arrive at some pictures soon with more. I see people are beginning to leave, so I have to rush. Perhaps the presentation is not very interesting, but I still think Ricardo Porro is not really an architect to totally ignore. And look at this ceiling. I mean, this ceiling is brilliant, and it's not just that. You see some other things here. And look at this space, and look at the way he employs the color also, so I imagine the children, passing by, they are influenced by the conditions of light and the colors and those, those butterfly wings, if we have to call them so. There is this is an abstract architecture, but it also has a figurative side to it, I think, and in that sense, it's interesting. I don't know about this. This is a little bit, but on the other hand, is it really so bad? Yeah, it's more predictable. I prefer the inside. There is more drama, spatial drama, and I particularly like this ceiling, because it's a little bit spider-like and it has a certain complexity. It is Gothic, but it's also Art Nouveau, and it's sensuous, but it's also rigorous structurally. I think it's interesting. Anyway, this is the plan. A large building that, again, public building. And yeah, what is interesting is here. Not everything in the buildings is interesting, but what is around either the auditorium or the public spaces, the entrance spaces, and so on. And this is dramatic, and I think it has a certain value, artistically, architectural. Well, the classrooms, especially without the disorder the children bring in, it seems to be a little dull. It's true. This one also is a little bit placid, and logement. This is a housing process, but I don't have pictures. This is a housing project that I only have one picture. Résidence universitaire, Le Château Saint-Silver. Again, he has portions of his buildings where the buildings seem to take off. And it's this accident that makes them a little bit interesting sometimes. This one we saw some pictures of it. Then Collège Elsa Triolet, a secondary school. Again, in the corner, the building becomes bird-like a little bit. Some housing, and it might be that this is the last picture on Ricardo Porro today. Now, this is the last picture, or maybe not, there is a zoomed in picture of the architect with his cane, probably around his 80s or so. Thank you very much.